Well, welcome to the Cup for Time podcast here at the Canton United Methodist Church. My name is Pastor Clay, joined again by Eric Stearns, back from our little bit of a break at the very start of the school year. Eric is the husband of our preschool teacher, and so with all the school starting, Eric took the week off last week, and so it was good to have Pastor Peggy come on as a visitor, but it was also really good to connect back with Eric as well. And so welcome back, Eric, and just glad to have you here for this conversation. We're going to dig into my message from Sunday, which was all about our fear of failure. I'm going to dig into some times when failure has happened, and how I, as a pastor, have encountered failure in ministry and dusted myself off, or allowed God to dust myself off, and kind of, just dig into what that fear can look like, and how we overcome that fear. So let's get into it.
Good. Awesome. One thing that stuck out to me in your sermon was I liked how you talked about living life carries risks, and with risk is always going to come the fear of failure, or the risk is that you're going to fail at whatever you choose to do. And I really liked how you talked about that. And from your perspective, how do you personally deal with that? The fear that whatever you're trying to do, you're not going to succeed.
Yeah. From my personal failing, from my personal perspective, I have been a part of those times in ministry where there are things that I think are important and things that I think are really going to benefit the life of the church. And either because of my failings, or in just this, it just didn't work for whatever reason. And sometimes it's because I didn't push hard enough on it. Sometimes it's because I didn't plan it well enough. Sometimes it's because I didn't promote it well enough as a pastor. But there have been times in the life of ministry where I was like, okay, I really think that this could benefit the church. And then just, it ends up not bearing fruit in the way that I think it should, or you throw a dart and you try it as long as you keep trying for a while, so you give it a chance to work, but then you realize at the end of the day, oh, that's not actually going to work, and you just have to you ask God for the fruit that that could come from it, and then just go back to the drawing board and say, okay, God, that wasn't it. And what does it mean for us to move forward? One of the things that comes to mind with that is prayer ministry. When I was at my previous appointment, we took a group of people to a training on prayer, of breakthrough prayer, of very specific, focused, intentional prayer, and doing prayer walks and stuff. And during that training, we had this powerful moment where we prayer walked the sanctuary of Mitchell Fusion Church, the United Methodist Church that meets on Dakota Wesleyan's campus. It's a fully chartered church. It's not just a campus ministry. It is a campus ministry, but it's more than that. It is a literal chartered church in the United Methodist Church. And we prayer walked their sanctuary before their Easter service, and they had the biggest Easter service that they had ever had. So I understand that God works through prayer walking. I get that God works in that way. And so we would do prayer walks almost on a monthly basis of hey, we are going to meet at this date, at this time, at this place. This is going to be our prayer focus. And I had a congregation of 68, 70 people in Burke, and I would have 2 people at the prayer walk, and then in Herrick it was harder because I had a church of 35 people, and sometimes it was just me. And so I would prayer walk our sanctuary and pray and say, hey, God, I think that this could really make an impact in the lives of those people around in our church and beyond, and so what more do I need to do? Why is this not working? Why is this failing? Is it me? Am I the problem? And just, I eventually just had to, I just had to say goodbye to it and just, move on, because it wasn't, it was no longer worth me investing time and energy and heartache into it. And then just, thinking about how that translates now that I'm in a different appointment, and I've been here for 3 years now. And like, I still think a prayer ministry would be a great thing for our church. But it's like, I'm so afraid of that previous failure coming into fruition again. So how do I even get the bat off my shoulder for it? I just cannot get myself fired up for it in this moment right now, because it was such a hard part of ministry in a previous space. So I don't know if that's answering the question, but that's just something that I'm wrestling with right now. And like, the idea of failing, I have failed before, and now just, am afraid of initiating something because I'm afraid of failing again.
That's tough.
Yeah. And there's no good answer to that. I mean, I just continue to be in prayer and say, okay, God, is this the time? And I don't feel that I'm hearing, yes, this is the time to really push and go for it. That's not where I'm feeling that we're at right now. And so it's just kind of a matter of staying connected to God in the midst of that. And just, I still think it's a good idea, and I still think that it can work, and not just to promote numerical growth, but really for us to grow in our depth of faith and our engagement in the community. And it's just kind of a matter of when is the time to take the risk.
Okay, since you mentioned this, how do you balance numerical growth with kind of depth of understanding for the congregation, for the people you're trying to lead? How do you balance that? Because I mean, if you have no people, it doesn't really matter how much one person grows. You know what I mean?
Yep.
We're taught to reach the masses. How do you balance that?
Right. The easiest answer is that I don't really. I mean, if one person is going to grow from it, then it's worth doing. When I was before I was a pastor, I was leading a Bible study in a church in Sioux Falls. And I had literally 2 people come to it. It was usually just me and this one other person. And we fully engaged. We did the study. It was around spiritual practices and like how we, engage in a life of prayer in different and creative ways. And this person and I ended up having these wonderful conversations as a result of it. And did I reach as many people as I wanted to? No. Do I think it was a good study? Yes. I mean, because I know, because of the conversations we were able to have and the impact that has continued to have on that person because of the things that they have told me, even, to very recently. I've just, I remember how much fun that was. And I remember how much I learned then, and yada, yada, yada. So I'm okay with that. I know that made an impact on one person, and that's one more person than had that experience before. So I'm willing to be that guy. I'm willing to have that numerical failure in order to grow in a spiritual sense. But there are times where it just, where it doesn't work and you have to move on. But, the Bible study was a set amount of time. It was a 6-week study. It was not going to go on. It wasn't the launching of a new ministry. It was a short-term Bible study that just one person came to, so yeah. Had I been trying to launch that into a ministry, then it would have been, then that's where the balance would have come in and said, this is not worth my energy. This is not going to be, it comes down to stewardship of time. Like, this is not going to be a good stewardship practice of the time that I've been given to serve the congregation.
I mean, this fear is definitely the one I struggle with the most. Fear of being alone doesn't really bother me. I'm an extrovert, but I kind of enjoy being by myself.
Sure.
It was funny when you went through that 2 weeks ago and talked about where you planted on that survey. We did that survey as a group of engineers. 10 of us, 12 of us last year. And as you can about imagine, everyone but me ended up in a very introvert sense, on the left side. I can't remember, I was all over there. And I
Sure.
was very extroverted way on the right side. And it was just very funny because me and no one else had a party over here. Um, yeah, I mean,
Yeah, the people
it
that
was just
like to
funny
be
when you brought
alone
that
are in a big group of people, and the people that like people are all by themselves.
up.
Hooray! We did it.
Much.
We solved it.
Yep. So that was kind of funny. But
That's
no,
all.
fear of failure has always been the thing I've struggled with the most.
Oh yeah.
Not to a point where I don't want to try things,
Mm.
but more I get into them and maybe I'm not as good at whatever thing as I think I should be.
Yep.
Um, always trying to be better, which I think is always a good thing to try to be better at what you're doing, but always also feeling like I'll never get to where I want to be, and kind of almost being down on myself or
Yep.
beating myself up. So I'm not achieving what I think I should be able to achieve. You know what I mean?
Yep. Absolutely. Oh yeah. Like that brings me back to the time that I learned how to ski when I was in high school. Like, so we, a fellowship of Christian students, we got together and we're like, we're going to go to this rally out in the hills and we're going to ski the day before and whatever. And it was like 3/4 of the way through my senior year of high school. My teacher, Mike Murray, is teaching me how to ski. He's also our faculty advisor for FCS. And I was just like, I was getting down on myself because I was falling like crazy, like, and here I am. I'm like, I should be better at this because all my friends are like doing, no one did like the black diamond at Terry Peak, but like they're making it down the hill without falling. I, however, at one point in time fell and the brake mechanism of my ski froze up and then my ski shot down the hill. Like, this is where we're going on this trip. And I'm getting really down on myself and just hard on myself. And like, I'm never going to get to where I'm going to be, good at this or whatever. And Mike Murray looked at me because he was also a wrestler. And he's just like, you just finished your wrestling season. You just finished your wrestling career in Gregory and period, because I didn't wrestle in college. And he's like, what was easier, your last takedown or your first takedown? And I was like, my last one. He's like, what did you do? And I was like, I practiced and I got better and I worked and, he's just like, it's the exact same thing. What's going to be the easiest thing the last time you go down the hill? What's going to be the hardest thing right now? And like, really kind of gave me a, little pep talk there on the side of the hill. It's good when we have people around us that can kind of pull us out of that funk.
Absolutely. I think that's huge.
Yep.
Because sometimes you can't get out of your own way. You can't.
Oh gosh,
there's that mental block. Well, I mean, just kind of like you're talking with prayer walks.
Mm-hmm.
You got that mental block right now that says, no, we're not doing this again. And it probably could. I mean, it could take someone else to say, no, Clay, we need to do this.
Right.
And maybe it takes some of that burden off of you that someone believes in you.
Right.
To be able to ski.
So who's been that for you, Eric? Who's been that person that kind of pulls you out of the funk?
No specific time that I can think of, but I just think about times where I don't feel like I'm as, I don't feel like I'm being a good engineer or a good dad or a good farmer or whatever. To think my many roles that I play, my wife is always there. Like, no, you're actually really good at what you do. And at least that's what she says anyway. But no, she's always very encouraging, and that always goes a long ways. She's always very encouraging. So how about for you?
Yeah, Lindsay for sure. Absolutely. But I've been granted a lot of really cool clergy mentors, especially when it comes to ministry stuff, like people that are in the thick of it or were in the thick of it and really get it in the same way of like an engineer colleague might for you. If not just Steve, but also Steve, but just, current people that I'm currently serving with that just, I can, even today I was running into a thing where I was like, is this something or is this dumb? And I can just like, here's the idea and let me verbal vomit it out to you. And, they can refine it for me and kind of like pick through and say, okay, have you thought of XYZ? And, and so that helps get me out of the loop of like, okay, I just need to put this somewhere And then, is this a thing? And then how to improve it? And then, and vice versa. Like those are ongoing conversations among pastors that are constantly happening over Facebook Messenger in my world. And so, yeah, there are definitely a couple of people that I really, really look to for wisdom in that way. So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's a couple of guys that the office next to mine, and on both sides, I feel like I can just walk into their office and
Yep.
Shoot ideas to them and see what they think, and
Definitely.
it makes a world of difference, and it helps me be a lot more successful when I come up with an idea that they're like, yeah, I would run with that. Then, you know what I mean? And then you're like, okay, if there's two smart people that think this way, then it must be a good idea.
Clearly, yes. Yep. Nice. But that's awesome.
So I think you need to share the story of when you tried to wing a sermon during seminary. Like,
yeah. Yep. I mentioned it in the sermon, and it was actually really funny because my friend Pastor Steph was in the congregation on Sunday that was in this preaching class with me. We were talking after church on Sunday. She's just like, were you thinking about that time when I, completely failed to prepare a sermon for class? And I was like, no, not really even at all. But apparently Pastor Steph did it too when we were in advanced preaching lab. But no, when I was taking sermon delivery class in seminary, we were given the assignment. We ended up preaching 6 sermons throughout the entire semester long course. The first one was with a full manuscript. So you write the sermon, you take the sermon with you into the pulpit, and you preach it. That was the entire, and then you receive feedback. Then it was 1 page of notes, and then it was no notes. And we did one practice one that was 5 minutes, and we did one real one that was 15 minutes and 30 seconds. That was all that was the amount of time that we were given by our professor, Randy Moss, which it was my turn to practice my no-note sermon. So my 5-minute no-note sermon. And we get to class, we say a prayer because it's seminary. That's how we started every class, was with prayer. And then Randy says, Clay, you're up. And I said, what now? And he said, you are up for your 5-minute no-note sermon. It was on the syllabus. Like, you should have known and you should have prepared. But I did not even a little bit have any clue whatsoever that I was up that day. And so I was like, well, this is going to be interesting. So I grabbed my Bible and, thankfully I had been translating through Philippians in my Greek class. And so it was like I had just dug into something pretty hard, and I knew how to then twist that into not just giving a lecture on this word in Greek, but how does this really connect us to the text, and how does this really connect us to Jesus? And I think I made it about 3.5 minutes before I just said amen, because it was not going great. And so our motto in that class if you couldn't land the plane, crash it. If you can't land it, crash it. Just get out of it. Just dump. And and Randy looked at me. He's like, for not knowing what you were doing, you did okay. He was not overly congratulatory. It was not a sermon that, blew the roof off of the place and inspired everyone to live their life for Jesus. But it was serviceable. As we all know, if you're a part of the church, or, Eric, as you know, I am not a no-notes preacher. I am a 1 page of notes preacher. That when I was in seminary, that was the best that I felt, the best that I preached. And that was just kind of, and then just kind of, that's how that developed for me as it really started in seminary, and just the experience of being completely blind on a no-note sermon. Yeah. It was serviceable. It was not good. It was not great. It was not fun. It was not. Yeah. But I never did that again. I've never been not prepared again. So I at least learned something. So it's not a total failure if you learn something.
Right. Exactly. Thank you for sharing.
Yes, of course. I'm always willing to share the moments when Clay gets it wrong. So yeah. Yep.
Well,
My fear of failure. That's, I mean, I think that's why that I wrestle with that so much now, is because, there are times in this when presumably I know how to preach a sermon, but there are times where I sit down to write and it's just like, what's a sermon? How does this work again? What are how do I make the moving parts happen? And and then, I'll run through it on Sunday morning because I practice before y'all get there on Sunday morning. And I'll get done and I was like, I don't have time to rewrite the whole thing. So this is just what we're going for today, and then someone after church would be like, that's exactly what I needed to hear. And it's like, oh my gosh, are you sure? But I mean, the only thing that I know is that God is good, and so, yeah.
Anything else?
We focused a lot on the Moses story, but we also did read the story from Joshua. I mentioned this a couple weeks ago when we were talking about our fear of other people. It comes time for the people of God to move to Jericho. And as we know from the song, Joshua fit the battle of Jericho. Joshua sent spies in, and the spies were struck by fear. And it was a little bit the fear of failure, but also the fear of those other people and saying, well, the land's not that good and there's giants and we're scared and this is a bad idea. And so Joshua had to deal with spies that were saying that, and like going not just to Joshua and the other leaders, going to anyone that would listen and like working against him. And so he became the leader of the people by the divine decree of God. Moses died. God comes right to Joshua and then said, I'll be with you. No one can defeat you as long as you're faithful to the word. And just, do not be afraid, for I am with you wherever you go. And like, thanks be to God for that, because there are times when it feels very scary to follow God and very scary to do the things that God's called us to do. And so Joshua has to deal with the people that are afraid, doing a hard thing that they were too afraid to do the first time. The whole reason why the people of God had to wander in the desert for 40 years is because they got right to the edge of it, and then they got afraid and they doubted. And God said, okay, cool, you're not ready. So this entire generation is going to wait. And it'll be the next generation. Moses is going to wait because Moses did not fearlessly lead the people. And so Joshua is the one that gets called to really take the people of God into the land. And so he's dealing with a fearful people to begin with. And then he's dealing with people that are poisoning the well, as it were, of turning the tides against what God's told them to do. And he has to lead in the midst of that. And that can be so hard and so challenging. It would have been normal for him to be afraid under normal circumstances because he's young and untested. And then just to have this other level of fear placed upon him, this other level of challenge placed upon him. I mean, there's a reason why God had to say what God had to say. And mercifully and thankfully, God's words were true and faithful. And, that gives hope to you and to me. That's the reason why we read that story on Sunday, or we read that passage of scripture, is just to kind of like reveal that this is the consistent nature of who God is. God was with Moses. Moses had all kinds of excuses as to why he wasn't going to be the one to go. And God said, you're not going to go alone. I'm going with you and it's going to be okay. And then Joshua, is raised up to leadership in the midst of this really fearful and tumultuous time. And God has to say, I'm going to be with you. And so when we face those times when we're afraid, or, there's things that have turned the tide against us, or we're just dealing with our fear, we can consistently know who God is in the midst of those moments.
Well, what's next week, Clay?
Yeah, so next week is the final week in this sermon series. We're going to be moving on from fear as we bring the month to an end. And we're going to be dealing with, we talked at the very start of it that fear has benefits and there are some things worth fearing. And so we're going to really dig into what the fear of the Lord is. There are 4 different passages in the book of Proverbs that say that the beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord. And so the fear of the Lord is very... Sorry, that's gross. The fear of the Lord is very important. And
Mhm.
so we're going to be digging into what that phrase means, because when we hear the fear of the Lord, we hear fear. We hear the
Mhm.
fear of the Lord. We hear it as it is said, but that's not what it means. Like, fear doesn't mean, oh, I am afraid, the phobia type fear. What the fear of the Lord really means is awe and reverence and respect. And I think that phrase has been used to, well, you have to be afraid of God because God can condemn you to eternal punishment, and so you better be faithful. Like that fear of the Lord has been instilled on people, has been inflicted on people, and I want us to dig into what that phrase really means. And so we're going to be hearing the first time it's heard in the first time it's said in Proverbs, and then also what Paul says to Timothy at the very end of their time together, where Paul says to Timothy, God has given us a spirit of power, a spirit not of fear, not of timidity, but one of power to go forth and do the things that God's called us to do. And so we're going to be wrestling with what the fear of the Lord really looks like and how we then live in the fear of the Lord to live lives that are unafraid. So wrapping everything up in a nice little bow, I hope.
I like
So,
that.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I agree. Your brain goes to a place that shouldn't. So
Yeah, definitely.
looking forward to it.
Yeah. So,
Well, thanks for joining us in this week's Cut for Time podcast. Join us again next week in person at 10 a.m. or online or back here for the podcast next week.
thanks for listening to our Cut for Time conversation. Join us for worship in person or on Facebook Live Sundays at 10 o'clock Central Time. And now go in peace and serve the Lord.